I just want to make sure it started the webcasting. Right, that's good. Okay, I'm just going to Hiya, you coming in? We're just about to start. How are you? Let's get going. Where'd you go? Should we go? Yeah, good start. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Library of Mistakes. I think there must be a lot of new faces here because you've all been terribly sedate, sitting down quietly and not partaking of the free booze at the back as much as our normal audience who come along are. So you'll know for next time. It's a bit of a party here. We always try and have a bit of fun. For those of you who don't know, I'm David, and I work with Russell and Lauren and various others in running the library here. The Library of Mistakes is your library. It's a free to all, open to all library, free to use. If you go to the website, you'll find information there on how you can attend the library. You can come and read, and that's, of course, what we want you to be doing in a library with such wonderful books. Also, it has details of the courses that we offer. They're excellent. I attended it myself about 15 years ago the first time I probably met Russell. And if you want to know about financial history, that's the course to do. And also, very wonderfully, is part of the income stream that helps keep these libraries, this library, and all the other things we do free. So just quickly, just to say that we have a series of events, as you know, this week and last for the Edinburgh Finance Festival. This is taking place across Edinburgh with various participants, the Global Ethical Finance Initiative, FinTech Scotland, the Scottish Government. But as I said to people last week, we're by far and away the best part. So and we are. I mean, like, you know, this is proper festival stuff where we're discussing Edinburgh's new enlightenment and stuff like that. So I hope you have a very good time. I should point out we have another event on Wednesday. Mario Piscini from the Treasury coming up to talk about money, and it's going to be excellent. So I've seen your faces, and if you don't turn up, you'll all be in trouble. And then on Thursday, we have a new podcast. We're taking on a new podcast, a long time in finance. Two guys, Jonathan Ford and Neil Collins. I can remember their names. They run this fabulous podcast that's now coming under the auspices of the Library of Mistakes, and they're going to be speaking with Ian Fraser, the author of Shredded, about the wonderful bank that was RBS and what happened to that. So I think that's pretty much everything. Yeah, I should say these things cost money, as you know. There are various QR codes around if you want to donate to the library. Please do. We also have merchandise at the back, and if I can get the machine working because I'm on my own tonight, I will try and sell you something. I suggest you don't leave without a Library of Mistakes t-shirt. It's the most fashionable thing you can buy this year, part of the winter season in the Edinburgh Fashion Festival, I suggest. Anyway, I'm going to hand over to Enda and to Patrick to talk about the new enlightenment. Give them a big clap, please. Enda, here you go.
Yeah, that's it. Hello, good evening, everyone. My name is Enda Delaney. I'm the Director of Research at the Edinburgh Futures Institute, and I'm also, and this is relevant, Professor of Modern History at the University of Edinburgh. I've heard all the jokes about a historian and the Futures Institute, so you can save those for later on. One of the great advantages about being at the Futures Institute is to come across some really wonderful people. And Dr. Patrick Schotanus is, in a sense, a polymath that the Futures Institute is very much his home. He's well-versed in economics, but also cognitive science, psychology, an embarrassing range of disciplines in which he is comfortable working with. And I think that's what makes Patrick such an important partner for the Futures Institute. So being part of the Institute, but also in partnership with the Institute, because he's able to bring this sort of range of disciplines, but also to think about what we would call, might sound a bit of a cliche, real-world questions. So, Patrick, we're going to hear a little bit more about your current proposal, but tell us a little bit about yourself. What's your background? what have you been doing, you know, your sort of academic, but also your professional background.
Sure. I was born in the Netherlands a few decades ago, longer than I wish. But I've lived most of majority of my life abroad, including London and New York and Singapore. But the last 20 years I've lived in Edinburgh. And my educational background started with an MBA at the University of Edinburgh, University of Groningen. Then I did a master's in financial engineering at UC Berkeley, and I did a PhD at the University of Essex. And those last two were sponsored by my employers at the time. I've been working professionally until a few years ago for 30 years in investment management, starting in banking. And then I decided a few years ago that I wanted to dedicate the rest of my career to developing my market mind hypothesis, which in a way the PhD was already formalizing. So I like to think of myself as a pracademic, not only as you explained, interdisciplinary, working with other academics in other fields, but also bridging it with industry. Since then, last year I established the Market Mind Foundation, MMF, that's the short for it there, which is a Scottish educational charity, and that has been a partner resident of EFI since April, so that's where I'm based. And together with a growing group of collaborators, we're developing the Market Mind Hypothesis, which is a heterodox theory. And we do events, we do research, my book was published in 23. We're deriving a course from it and all kinds of things, yes.
Great. Just before moving on, just to remind people that the Futures Institute, unlike any other building in the University of Edinburgh, is open to everyone. So you're welcome to take a peek in it, see Patrick in his habitat. One of the distinctive features that many people here with an Edinburgh background will remember that it was, of course, formerly the Edinburgh Royal Infirmary, but do come in and have a look. Anyway, we're here this evening in the iconic library of mistakes. What do you think has been the biggest mistake of all?
I think that is contemporary economics, and that is mainstream economics combined with behavioral economics, and then particularly the mechanical worldview that it has, which in simple terms, and there's a long history behind this, but in simple terms, it not only perceives, but also treats the economy as machine, the market as automaton, and us agents as robots. And as I said, there is a long history behind this. What we want to do is basically go back to some of the earlier thinking of economics, and then, of course, personified by Adam Smith with the combination of the theory of moral sentiments and the wealth of nations, because that connection is often forgotten. So that is the big mistake, and the way that we look at it is, instead of as it was inspired by what is known as physics envy or mathematics envy, you go actually to other disciplines, particularly then cognitive science, and argue that instead of only the physical, you have the psychophysical, there is psychology, there is behavior, there is emotions, and that's a different angle. We can talk about that later.
Good. I thought I wrote long books on, I came across the Market Mind Hypothesis, which is, I think, weighs in at 440 pages, something like that. It was published in 2023. There's a film that I really enjoy as a non-expert in financial matters, and it's called Margin Call. And in that film, the Jeremy Irons character, who I guess is the sort of chairman of the fictional company which represents Lehman Brothers, he says to one of the analysts, "Can you explain to me, as you would explain to a 12-year-old, what the market mind hypothesis is?"
Yes. So, in very simple terms, it formalizes what investors have always casually referred to as the market mind, or the mind of the market. When, for example, you look at George Soros, a well-known investor, his bestseller book, The Alchemy of Finance, he subtitled this as Reading the Mind of the Market. And with cognitive science, we're trying to formalize that. So in other words, the market mind, in a way, really exists. It's just that it hasn't been taken seriously. And when people wonder, well, okay, so you want to change the theory, but is the theory really that important? Has it practical implications? How relevant is it? I think we should, because you refer to movies, so I'm going to quote a few people who highlight how the theory actually filters through to all kinds of practices. Right, so there's first John Maynard Keynes, who states, and I quote, "The ideas of economists, both when they are right and when they are wrong, are more powerful than is commonly understood. Indeed, the world is ruled by little else. Practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influences are usually slaves of some defunct economist." And then more recently, Angus Deaton, Edinburgh's own Angus Deaton, Nobel laureate, states that we economists often assume a mental policy expertise for which we have no qualification, with predictable, disastrous outcomes. Even so, thoughtful critics contend that we still retain great influence and thus continue to cause great harm. But does the fault lie with just a few powerful individuals, or, here it comes, is there a deep flaw in economics that continues to lead its practitioners astray? I tend to favor the latter hypothesis. Above all, we need to spend more time with philosophers recapturing the intellectual territory that used to be central to economics. So that is a mea culpa, and that is kind of what the MMH takes as a cue. Philosophers are among cognitive scientists, and they help us, together with neuroscientists, to formalize this market mind. Now, there's one more thing I want to add, again, as simple as possible. The MMH submits a market mind principle, and that is based on a two-leg premise. The market as mind, which I already explained, but there is also the mind as market. And that is more from a micro individual perspective. In other words, think of your mind body like your microbiome in your stomach, where we have bacteria and little organisms, and they're all, in a way, forming an economy, right? Competing, collaborating. There is demand, supply, there's exchange of fluids, etc. So, in other words, to finish, the MMH submits that minds and markets are an entangled continuum, and their self-organization, either at the micro or at the macro level, is basically done via a type of economic forces. So when we criticize economics, we're not throwing out the baby with the bathwater.
Okay, good. Maybe just to push you a little bit more on that, I first met Patrick at an event in which David Krakauer, who's the president of the Santa Fe Institute, was speaking at, and we got talking, Patrick and myself. Well, one of the interesting things about the Santa Fe Institute was set up by Murray Gell-Mann and other very distinguished Nobel awardees in the 1960s, I think, or early 1970s, is that there's no disciplines, no departments, there's no ecosystem of the economics department, the philosophy department, or that it's basically organized around the problems in which the people who are the researchers there are concerned with. And it strikes me that you have echoes with that in a sense you're starting out with the problem or the challenge, and then you're drawing on the appropriate sort of scholarly knowledge to help you to answer those problems, whereas very often in traditional sort of academia, people start off with the discipline. I'm an economist, I'm a historian, I'm a philosopher. But maybe could you just reflect for a moment on that?
Yeah, I think in a way that's my practical background, right? For having worked in investment management, where Also, you need to take split-second decisions, and you look at what the problem is and what the implications are. And sometimes the theory helps, and at other times the theory doesn't help. And the particular thing that, and I attended that meeting, as you know, and they're specialized in complexity theory, which itself is already interdisciplinary. We're dealing with a complex adaptive system, right? The economic system is a complex adaptive system. Our mind-body is at the micro level a complex adaptive system. There's no linearity. And the thing that makes it very complex, and this was a question at the end of the Q&A, as you perhaps remember, I asked David, I said, the moment when human agents are part of the system and consciousness enters the equation, isn't that where things really become complicated? And I think David kind of agrees with that and said we need more research in that. And that is exactly what we're doing. So if you want to really pinpoint and say, okay, what contemporary economics, what is the blind spot? What is the elephant in the room that hasn't been addressed? It is this simple fact that human agents, first and foremost, are conscious beings. And that was already highlighted in 1925 by an economist, Frank Knight. And more recently, somebody pointed out, Robert Aumann, who was a Nobel laureate in 2005, wrote a paper, Why Consciousness? So there are more and more people going into this. But this is the link to the Santa Fe Institute and David's talk, which was very appropriate.
Good. Well, thanks very much. I mean, we're here this evening to talk about this wonderful new proposal that Patrick is developing called a New Economic Enlightenment. I've had the benefit of reading the full proposal, and I'm sure Patrick will be happy to share with relevant parties afterwards. But could you tell us a little bit more about what you intend doing? What's the big picture? Why now? Why is this really important in the world that we inhabit today?
Yeah, so we want to establish an alliance for new economic enlightenment, ANE, as I call it for short. And that idea is to correct and revitalize economics by reinvigorating via teaching, via research, via events, and via general public engagement, the intellectual curiosity and the innovative spirit of the Scottish Enlightenment. It will be created, that is the plan, if people, various parties sign up, but it will be created by a coalition of the willing. And those are so-called stakeholders who from the academic, from the public, and from the private sectors, who are not only sympathetic or interested in the Scottish Enlightenment, but realize that we should build on this in light of the challenges that the world faces. And in the proposal, I go into much more detail. For example, the wider context of this, the term polycrisis has been introduced, perhaps overused and misused of it, but it basically highlights that various challenges are connected, be it climate change, be it inequality, and so on. And if you, when I was much younger, I had the honor and privilege to work with the late Willis Harman, who was emeritus professor at Stanford. And based on research in the 1970s, I'm creating now the context for this, the historic context too. He wrote a seminal book called Global Mind Change. And in it, he highlights 4 challenges that, according to him, and this book was published in 1988, mind you, 4 challenges that the world would increasingly face. Global degradation, not only climate change, but also decreasing biodiversity, increasing pollution, and nowadays we know that via microplastics and nanoplastics, etc. Inequality, or what he called the equity and justice challenge. 3, marginalization. Think of non-inclusiveness and increasing polarization. You can think here also in terms of populism versus globalization. But most importantly, The fourth challenge was worldview challenge. And in what Willis was saying is that that the worldview, that the economic way of thinking was incorrect. And why was this the most important challenge? Because that is how we frame all the other challenges. So that is the kind of the historic context. Now, to my final point on this question, Thomas Kuhn, who many of you may have heard, popularized this idea about paradigms and worldviews, right? They're kind of the same. It's just a way how assumptions, methods, etc., how we kind of deal with reality, how we view reality. And so he popularized in the 60s. It's often used in various ways. But a paradigm shift, what people forget is that Kuhn not only always emphasized that a change in worldview or paradigm view doesn't just happen with only negative evidence. So regardless of how many anomalies, the paradigm could remain unless there is an alternative, worldview. And that is what we submit, that the market mind, or basically new economic enlightenment, combining, going back to Smith with the theory of moral sentiments and the wealth of nature, but then put into modern code, so to speak, with the spearheaded by the market mind hypothesis, is that new alternative worldview. Why? Because it puts consciousness central. Instead of ignoring it, it puts consciousness central. And because of cognitive science, it has progressed so much that the study of consciousness is now becoming a science of consciousness. We can offer that as an alternative.
Great, thanks very much. Can I just push you a little bit further, just to make sure that I'm understanding? So in a way, because we're at this historical moment for the reason, the confluence of crises, whether you call it polycrisis or not, as you indicated, that's sort of perhaps overused a little bit, but environmental, economic, political, social inequality, that in a sense we need to stand back a little bit and rethink sort of the paradigms that we have traditionally been using to address these issues. Is that a...
Yes, and you know, I refer in my book, for example, I quote Einstein, but there are others who famously said that if he's dealing, if there is an issue, he said we should spend 95% on identifying the problem, and then or focusing on the question, and then 5% on the answer. If you look, for example, currently on the AI, right, the approaches as a practical implication, it spews out very easy and quick answers, but often it doesn't understand. It doesn't focus on what the question is. So that is the angle that makes us distinct from many other approaches, and certainly, let's say, the ivory tower type of thinking, what you often, as you already indicated, see in traditional academia. And finally, I mean, in terms of timing, apart from the fact that there is some urgency with certain of the problems that we face, to establish this in Edinburgh, New Economic Enlightenment, particularly the Edinburgh Futures Institute, symbolically the timing should be perfect, right? Because next year we're celebrating the 250th anniversary of the Wealth of Nations, at which point we can say, yes, that's great, but remember that Smith also published the theory of moral sentiments, and then we can build that case.
You've mentioned a couple of times, and maybe I just wanted to sort of reprise it a little bit, the whole idea of consciousness, which is essentially a subject that has preoccupied a lot of philosophers for a long time. One of the people which you cite in their proposal, David Chalmers, refers to as the hard problem because of the sort of the nature of identifying how consciousness works in not just all species, not just human beings. The huge amount of sort of intellectual effort that's gone into trying to understand consciousness. I'm not asking you to summarize all of that, but maybe just tell us a little bit about in the way we think we know what consciousness is because it's used, quite often in discussion. But what's your sort of understanding of the term? How would you, summarize what it, as it relates to your own particular work?
Yeah, so perhaps one way to explain this is that in behavioral economics, there is kind of a standard consensus which is based on the work of Kahneman and Tversky and others, and Kahneman has popularized this, namely the dual process or dual system way of thinking fast and thinking slow, right? And he divides this as system 1 and system 2 thinking. So system 1 is the thinking fast, it is your emotions and your intuition, whereas there is your system 2, which is your thinking slow, which is about your logic and your rationality. But that's kind of two-dimensional. In a way, consciousness is putting it in a 3D, the human mentality in a 3D sphere. And the way to think about consciousness is, in this format in particular, is to ask yourself, how can I make that distinction between system 1 and system 2 in the first place? In other words, how can I distinguish between being rational, as in system 2, and being emotional? Well, that is simple, right? Because both of these states are experienced completely differently, right? And that is consciousness. It allows you to make these distinctions. It allows you, and I refer to Robert Aumann, whose paper was fairly recently, 2024. He won the Nobel Prize on game theory. But he wrote this paper, Why Consciousness? And he explains this, for example, very much in the spirit of how I further explain it in the book. We can't go into too much detail, but where you basically say, okay, it has to do with, for example, incentives and how people are intrinsically motivated to have free will and go after something, which is not only your instincts, your system 1 driving you. A lot of it, of our mentality is unconscious, but ultimately even that is somehow, in whatever behavior, experienced. So in short, consciousness is about subjective experience and feelings that you have, rather than rational thinking or emotions.
Okay, good. I must confess I'm working on a book on the history of human cognition, and consciousness is a major challenge for me. So I thought I might try some shortcuts by getting Patrick to work it all out for me and shamelessly plagiarize all your ideas. Speaking of history, why is Adam Smith, also known as Brian Cox, an important thinker for you? Your document, you have quite a number of references. Much as it pains me as an Irish person, Scotland did produce some serious intellectuals in the 18th century. Ireland did too, including Francis Hutcheson, who you mentioned. But Smith in particular seems to me to be a sort of really important figure for you. And how does the new economic enlightenment fit as a sort of a legacy of the great thinking of the Scottish Enlightenment?
Yeah, so I kind of hinted at it already. So Smith wrote a theory of moral sentiments, which in simple terms is about, although it is set in a social setting in society, it's about the individual. And the Wealth of Nations then puts that in a very large global context. So that is from a macro perspective. Another way of saying that is that the theory of moral sentiments was a very early reflection of cognitive science, and the Wealth of Nations was a very early reflection of economics. And therefore, I argue that Adam Smith was the first cognitive. He was not just the father of economics, but he was the first cognitive economist, because he combined these two. And as Smith scholars or experts like Deirdre McCloskey, who was our inaugural guest speaker, said, it was economists not only forget the theory of moral sentiments, but forget that was, according to her, the book he loved most, because that's what he worked on most. Now, why is that also important? Because among the flaws in economics is their failure in a way to really combine microeconomics and macroeconomics, which is exactly what this is an early kind of connection is about. But also, now, Smith, in the theory of moral sentiment, this is often overlooked by, as far as I could estimate from the literature, underestimate the importance that Smith attached to exactly subjective experiences. Now, this goes back, as I mentioned before, something of this history goes back to Descartes and to Locke. Hume, for example, dismissed the distinction that Descartes and Locke copied this, made between primary qualities, basically quantities of objects that were measurable, and secondary qualities, which is of subjects, which to a point already refers to this consciousness. Right, so I want to quote, and that's why I have these papers, because I wanted to quote something so you know it from the original source. Right, so Smith in TMS explains when he interprets moral faculties in terms of positive valence of the senses, and putting that into an ontological angle. So I'm going to quote him now. Every sense is supreme over its own objects. There is no appeal from the eye with regard to the beauty of colors, nor from the ear with regard to the harmony of sounds, nor from the taste with regard to the agreeableness of flavors. Each of these senses judges in the last resort of its own objects. Whatever gratifies the taste is sweet. Whatever pleases the eye is beautiful. Whatever soothes the ear is harmonious. And here it is. The very essence of each of these qualities, so this is ontological, consists in its being fitted to please the sense to which it is addressed. It belongs to our moral faculties in the same manner to determine when the ear ought to be soothed, when the eye ought to be indulged, when the taste ought to be gratified, when and how far every other principle of our nature ought either to be indulged or restrained. So this is from part 2, chapter 5. To summarize, or to get to the point, what Smith is doing here is reconnect these secondary qualities of the subject with the primary qualities of the objects. In other words, in a way, trying to address the mind-body problem as it's known in cognitive science, which comes back to your point of the hard problem of David Charles.
Edinburgh seems to be, to me, an ideal location to develop a new economic enlightenment, given it's a centre of finance and banking with a strong historical backdrop. Why that is, we can sort of debate later, but it's how important do you think this is to develop a proposal, to develop the project in this great city of sort of finance and banking, and also within the Edinburgh Futures Institute?
Yeah, so on our website, which I wrote down, so this is marketmind.org, we acknowledge this history and give examples that some of the earliest banks were in Scotland, and Scotland was a pioneer in insurance. And of course, in investment management, there was very well-known stock-picking firms, right? Mm-hmm. Now, having said that, because of the changes in investment management, with passive investing growing, active investment management is a bit under pressure. And last year there was, for example, a meeting organized by the business school of the university together with the CFA. David was attending as well, about the demise of investment management in Edinburgh, and what could we do about this. And yes, I mean, in absolute terms, the assets under management that are managed by firms here in Edinburgh is growing, but in relative terms, it has decreased, and particularly the active part. There is a particular way of active investment management is that related to ESG, which I've started with in the late 90s already. And since then, it has been hijacked by quants and it has been hijacked by wokeism. But there remains this element of sustainability where we will continue to develop this. And one particular angle that I have in my proposal is called impact investing, if only because if you think about in the economic system, the two parts, right? There is the real economy of markets in goods and services, and there is the financial, psychological economy of markets and securities. And the whole idea is, of course, to benefit society, is that the financial, psychological economy allocates properly for capital to the real physical economy of markets. So that is effectiveness. Where a complete imbalance has occurred is in efficiency, right? There has been a complete focus on efficiency in markets to the point where, for example, passive investing doesn't care what happens to the real economy, right? You know that. The data that it uses is purely market data. It's not any fundamental, let alone macroeconomic data. And we're getting to the point where this imbalance is kind of starting to threaten, I think, the system again. So impact investing, it hasn't been around. I mean, yes, there is some history, but as it's known now, isn't been around. But it is exactly about active investing, trying to improve the effectiveness of capital so that it benefits the real economy. So that I detail again that in my proposal, but this is, yeah.
So, brass tacks. How can people help? Where can we find out more? How do we join the campaign? What are the next steps, Patrick?
So first of all, allow me to play devil's advocate, right? We can wallow in the nostalgia of the genius of Adam Smith and all the other distinguished contributors to the Scottish Enlightenment. Or, in light of the challenges that the world faces, we can do something with it and we can build on it, right? So, if you have sympathy with this, and I'd like you to think outside the box. So, for example, if you're in academia, and this is recorded, so it's not only for this audience, but whoever sees this, right? If you're a decision maker in academia or in the public sector or in the private sector, and you think you could, or you're interested to contribute, contact me or contact Russell or even David, and we're planning to organize an ANI meeting, I call it, a follow-up meeting where we have all these stakeholders that we would like to get on board. That includes the Scottish government, Scottish financial enterprise, skills development, Scotland, many others, but again, also academia and investment firms, and then discuss this proposal in detail. So that is one way. Another way is if you are interested to actively participate, but in a way passively you'd like to participate, or you like to support us financially as a patron in the background anonymously, again, contact Russell or contact me. But also the Market Mind Foundation, my charity, but also ANI in the toekomst, it will need legal advice, it will need accountancy advice. And if you have a firm like that and you would like to volunteer those services, it would help us a lot because, as you know, it's not cheap. And finally, even if you think, well, I can't help in any other way, perhaps in your network you know somebody or you know some party who could help, and just, get me in touch with them or get them in touch with me, and that would help. What would be really a pity if after this meeting, each one of you goes home thinking, that was interesting, fascinating. I really hope that somebody helps them. Because if everybody thinks that, nothing will happen. I think we have a window of opportunity Also because, as I said, other people are increasingly looking into this. We here in Edinburgh have a window of opportunity. There is the pressure, the urge to address some of these challenges in the proper way by asking the right questions. So that's what the proposal is about.
Great, thanks very much indeed. I think you picked up on another element of life in Edinburgh, and that is sort of civic pride, civic patriotism, the sort of ability for people to move beyond their very specific sort of bunkers and think about the wider society. Okay, I've been dominating Patrick asking all the questions. It's your turn now. So any questions, comments, responses to what Patrick has had to say?
Can I?
Sorry. Sure. Sorry. Could I ask how much capacity and appetite you think there is in Edinburgh in general, and perhaps university in particular, to address the Enlightenment and its sometimes tricky historical legacy? I was a student there 50 years ago, and I remember walking between the William Robertson building, the Adam Ferguson building, David Hume Tower. The first two names were disappeared a long time ago. David Hume much more recently, much more controversially. But one does wonder how much appetite there is there.
Can I just say that the William Robinson is still going? It's the history department. I can testify to that. But anyway, Patrick, what's the limitations intellectually?
Yeah,
sorry, that might mean, well, that's your sense to your question.
Yeah, I look at it to some extent as a Dutchman who's worked in investment management, and it's fairly blunt, and I don't have these sensitivities and all of that. I think I know they're there. Perhaps it becomes a self-selecting process, and in a way, we're not the base could be here. But currently, in the way that interdisciplinary research is taking place, people find each other across the world, and you invite them for guest lectures, or you go to guest lectures. Everything to collaborate is available in terms of tools. So, yeah, I guess my answer is it will become self-selective, and there is almost nothing I can do to convince people when you get in those type of discussions, for example, it often becomes very emotional, right, and that is already away from kind of the scientific, approach that is required. I don't know if I answered, but it is something that you're confronted with, but you just adopt, and we need to adapt, and it can never be, I think, a ultimate barrier and say we're not going to do it.
By coincidence, or was it, I was at a talk on Friday about feminist economics, and she raised many of the questions that you have done about the old economics and rational man and the details. And as you have said, the primacy of the economic lens for all the other crises that we are facing at the moment. Her particular thing, though, was about GDP and all of the things that are missed in the measurable things that go to GDP and the non-measurable things, can I call that women's work, that aren't measured in GDP, and wondering if looking at that as any part of your proposal.
In terms of, say, specific research projects, I haven't gone into that detail where I say, okay, we should include this or exclude that. I do know, for example, that I know there are people who are looking beyond the traditional GDP and other macro measures from whatever angles. I think it is Bhutan, for example, has its own measure on right. One project that I've been, also it's a separate proposal, but it is now all part of this bigger proposal, is something that I call economental. In other words, where you take the premise of that markets and minds are very much similar. In other words, the market is kind of a collective mind of individual minds. Then it means by definition that if the economy is very unhealthy, imbalanced, right, cheap money, whatever, or alternatively, the individuals, the conscious human agents are very unhealthy. They have an impact on each other. That's why the term economental health. So that is a project which I have a specific proposal already for, which is completely different than what is currently happening. I know it isn't that way directly related to GDP, but I think there are certain measurements, you know, mental health or unhealth in either a collective or is not measured in those, let's say, traditional physics and the material way. So it is very much, I think, along those lines that we push the boundaries and see what could be improved.
Good evening, Patrick.
Hi,
Robbie
Robbie.
Mochrie. I work a little bit with the Library of Mistakes, and before I start a question, I'd just like to say that we hope that you will all be able to come back in March next year, when we will be running a series of events to mark the 250th anniversary of the publication of Wealth of Nations. So in the library, we take Smith very seriously. As you realise, Patrick, I could probably spend hours questioning what you've said. I'm going to try and keep it a little bit, I'm going to try and keep it short. I'm going back to Deirdre McCloskey, not thinking about equality of permission, her current take on Smith, but going back slightly further to her work on Smith as a virtue ethicist. And perhaps I can throw in an observation from someone that we both know, Adam Dewar, that Adam Smith was not an economist, but a philosopher who made economics possible. Now, if we go to McCloskey's thinking about virtue ethics, as our analysis of virtue ethics, the point which she made about Smith was that he emphasized temperance. And indeed, you can read Theory of Moral Sentiments, the last 200 pages roughly of my version. He says all the virtues are equally important. And then at the end, essentially what he's saying, but temperance is the most important. And temperance is not, as perhaps you might think of it, signing off the booze. Instead, it is the willingness to defer gratification. I think that's how we might think of it nowadays. And that willingness to defer gratification is extremely important in economics. It's extremely important in financial markets. I think that when you say behavioral economics assumes system 1, system 2, that's one way, but there are other ways of giving a behavioral economics base. I don't want to go into those just now. But everything that I am reading, that I read about this, I keep coming back to this question of temperance. How do we throw sand into the wheels of our minds almost, so that the machine doesn't churn out the answer immediately? A bit like you were saying, AI gives you the glib immediate answer. How instead do we create the space for reflection, for thought, for awareness of more than the emotions, so recognizing the agency that you've talked about and the emotional nature of agency, the value of rational reflection, to get to the best possible kinds of decisions?
Well, first of all, I don't pretend to have all the answers or all the, you know, the interpretations that, as you know, Adam Smith has been hijacked by almost everybody for their own purposes, and you can read into it whatever. I'm cherry picking like everybody else. I guess I have the right, like everybody else, to pick the parts that are, to me, important. I would say that a quick answer to your question is that, and I think this is in the spirit, at least that's how I see it, where, for example, Gerd Gigerenzer and Emmanuel Derman and other people have argued that it is not about getting more and more data that we will find the answers. It is about also developing new tools and new methods. And you say it yourself, awareness you call, which is about consciousness, right? And I don't think that the current AI tools help us to allow this space and this time to come to, for example, the right questions. It is all focused on quick answers. So again, my answer is we need to, and this is part of this proposal, I literally state this, that we need to also, or more so, develop new tools and methods, which might mean a completely different way of developing AI from what LLMs are now doing in technical terms. The problem is, of course, that requires much more time to do, whereas it is much more easier nowadays to just, grab this data, scrape it from the internet. So it's all part of this challenge. The proposal is a very ambitious project, and people who want off-the-shelf solutions and have some results within a year, that's not what the proposal is about. But we have to, if it is a 1,000-mile journey, we have to set the first steps, right? Every 1,000-mile journey starts with the first steps, and we've kind of said that, but many more need to follow. But I agree with you.
You spoke about how sort of Edinburgh is a good place to sort of base this kind of project. And you've kind of talked about how you obviously can't expect immediate results from such an ambitious kind of rethinking, as it were. Do you see in the sort of medium to long term, do you see opportunities to sort of implement or test the tools and hypotheses that you develop in Edinburgh, in Scotland, or do you see these more as abstract things, the ideas to be developed in Edinburgh, then given to the academic world to take to their own countries and apply as they see fit?
No, I mentioned before that I like to think of myself as a pracademic, so the research is both theoretical and empirical, and I'll give you an example. In 2019, EFI, promoted by Owen Kelly, a former colleague of Enda, gave us a grant to do research, and that was empirical research. I got high-frequency data from Thomson Reuters at the time, which is now LSE Group, on, I won't go into details, but it was high-frequency data, and basically what I did with a neuroscience collaborator of mine, Aaron Schurger, who was in the US, try to look at, connect the two concepts. One concept in cognitive science, known as the readiness potential, and the concept of excess volatility in finance, in investment management, right? Basically noise traders. Fisher Black, Robert Schiller wrote about this and so on. Again, the paper is available, but the idea was this is kind of a proof of concept. We found similar patterns in what is the readiness potential and the excess volatility. The idea is now, and I write in this proposal, is if we get, we want to test this in a lab. So there is on the top floor in EFI, there is, for example, an lab for with eye tracking equipment. As you know, all this equipment becomes more and more non-intrusive. So that you can have subjects, students do this. If you combine it with EEG, so eye tracking and EEG, then you have two sources of data, and you can run experiments with this. Again, we can't go into detail, but the ultimate aim is that if once you have this proof of concept as a follow-up to this pilot project, you can go to an investment bank or a hedge fund and say, look, with this, we can completely change the traditional risk management approaches like value at risk. I give this example because there are many more. The economental, in a way, is also, it is towards the practical. Yes, it is based on theory, but we definitely want to make it tools, methods, to benefit practitioners in whatever of the areas they're working.
I should say that Patrick is located in a ward as they're called. Not a space in which they're called wards because they were originally boards, but with people from the financial services industry, and so he's actually not in an ivory tower. He's actually working next door to people who are practitioners in their. That does sound a bit ominous. Patrick's located in a ward, but he knows what I mean with the important thing. There's one more question, I think, down to the end.
Yeah, thank you very much. I really enjoyed the talk. It was very wide-ranging, which was, lovely. I wanted to put a provocation and a question, and the provocation is whether we talk about the market as a machine or the market as a mind, we're essentially using a metaphor which gives the market agency. And the market doesn't really exist, right? You could argue it doesn't. It's an agglomeration of individuals and institutions represented by indicators. So my provocation would be, is there danger in giving the market agency in that way in the centre of the sort of theorising? And my question is a super naive question. I'm not an economist. You didn't mention capitalism once. Was that intentional? And either way, what is your reflection on the fact that we don't mention it in this context?
Yeah, excellent questions, all of them. On that last part, I think it is very politicized, capitalism as a term, all that. So when, for example, when I talk about economics, I mean that it includes the nested disciplines of investment of finance in the theoretical sense, but also the practical disciplines of investment management, policy making, and regulation. And capitalism is to me not the laissez-faire complete type. It is simply allowing allowing markets to benefit society rather than central planning. Now, on your provocation, when we had the first event we organized was an inaugural symposium in Penmuir House. Robbie knows about this. It was we had speakers varying from famous investors to policymakers to neuroscientists to philosophers, and one of the speakers was talking about that it is about metaphors. In a way that is not bad, because it helps us to build a narrative about it and explain it and all that. So metaphor itself, and even there were discussions about whether the market has a mind or whether the market is a mind, and to me that is just, it misses the point in a way. What is important, this is very important, is that we need to remember, and this has no political association with it, that throughout history, so when people look at current problems, or certainly after the GFC, and they said, oh, there's an easy scapegoat, right? Free markets are the problem. Historically, free markets have never existed. It's a straw man. They were always manipulated. And this comes to the other part of your provocation. Should we, rather than allow central planners who pretend to be omniscient completely manipulate those markets, often politically? I mean, the amount of manipulation which has been going on in the last decades has now grown to an industrial scale, particularly particularly central banks, but not only central banks with, but even now you see concentrations of large companies in almost every sector, the big three of everything, I call them, and where antitrust policy is completely outdated because it doesn't adjust to the current nature of the. So, if you follow the MMH, then in the extreme you have to conclude that healthy minds are free minds. And if that is the case, and you allow that, then that to some extent that has to be reflected in the market, which becomes a healthy market. And most of the critiques of free markets were because of crisis, but often if you investigate it, it was by some form of manipulation. And this could be like you know, people, you know, short squeezing or market participants manipulating it, not only central banks, but in all these instances. And I have no illusion that that would ever happen, right? Complete free markets. All I point out is that the problems we now have is actually more about manipulation than too much freedom in the market.
Just one last question there.
I mean, you talked right at the start about all the various problems that we all know them, the huge problems the world faces. But how would, I mean, and then you've also, Patrick, suggested that people like us here might want to go and spread the word about this. But in order to do so, I think we need some kind of, you know, guidance here. So how would the new economic enlightenment practitioners, if you want to put it that way, address these big problems that you were talking about in the world? Say, for example, let's take one, government debt and borrowing, or trade imbalances. I mean, how would the narrative that change from the way it's described now?
Okay, so I mentioned in a way investment management, right? That we would value at risk as a completely mechanical based approach, right? And it completely failed during the times when it was necessary. But let's focus indeed on policy makers. We know that Occupy Wall Street, that movement was anger, including for the younger generations, where it was clear that profits were privatized and losses were socialized, right? And we know that the debt overhang or the debt dependence that we now have, both in absolute and relative terms, has grown because of cheap money and making it available and so on. Part of this is, for example, the allowing inflation in the financial markets, which is fine, and inflation in the real economy, i.e. salaries of the average employee, is not fine. So that is a fundamental change in the way of thinking, right? So, and then I know that is just thinking. How are you then going to put it into policies? But I don't have an answer for that. But that is where we should be heading. I have a section in the proposal. I call them value propositions on policy making, on education, various areas where I go a little bit into more detail, where some of this is should be changed. So yes, yeah. Let me leave it at that.
Yeah.
I'm just. It's a bit like, you know, like at the end of a church service. So I'm going to give the notices now. There's one more notice that I want to bring to your attention, is that we've got an extra event, actually, if I didn't mention before, next Tuesday, where George Selgin, who is a very highly respected academic in the Cato Institute in the United States, is coming over to speak about the Great Depression in the United States and the New Deal, and Franklin D. Roosevelt's work on that, and his relationship with John Maynard Keynes, which I know is of great interest to our errorist in residence, Robbie. But this is just to give you an example. This is what we do at the library. So if you want to come along, please just go to the website. I think the tickets are on sale now. We have plenty of events coming up over this winter, including our famous film nights, where we have a finance-related film, and Russell gives a talk beforehand about the financial background of it. But before we end tonight, I just want to say thank you very much to our guests, Patrick and to Enda, for a very interesting chat. If you want to get involved in the project, contact them or contact us at the Library of Mistakes, and we'd be more than happy to put you in touch. Let's give them a round of applause.
Just turn the